My name is Patrick Shear. I'm a fisherman with a watershed problem, and I am very solutions oriented. And I'd like to present two of the most important people working on a very important solution called the Reasonable Assurance Plan, which is the RAP for short. And they will be introducing it. The first one is one of the toughest jobs in Miami-Dade County. Pamela Sweeney is the senior manager of the water resources section of DERM, which is not an easy job, and also our very important Chief Bay Officer, Irela Bague. Please welcome them as they introduce the Reasonable Assurance Plan to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Hold on, it's coming. I'm gonna start here and we're gonna end up over there. That's how it's gonna go. So I'm gonna kick it off with, we have to start somewhere to get anywhere. And that's basically the plan that we have at the table right now with our reasonable assurance plan. If you go to the next slide. I don't know if we have a clip. Next slide. There we go. So as you all know, and you know, I reminded everyone earlier today that when the task force met, our first recommendation was focused on water quality improvements. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And basically, it says it right there. It's create a plan. They weren't just they weren't prescriptive of how we would get there. And you know, I certainly am no scientist. There's my scientist. I'm a political scientist, but we knew what the problem was: excessive nutrient pollution. Not that nutrients are bad, but excessive nutrient pollution. And so, how do we lower those nutrient pollution levels? Well, we have to set a target. And so, I am happy to say, let's see if this works. Where are we? Yes, I'm happy to say that that's exactly what we're doing. Okay. We are starting small. This is true, but there's a method to our plan. And it's, you know, it would take us what, 10 years to do an entire plan for Biscayne Bay. So we have to start somewhere, and we're starting where we're bleeding. So, and the science drives us. You heard the mayor this morning. We can't make decisions without the science. We're letting the science lead. And so, Pamela will start going through the current situation because we need science to lead and help us move policy forward. And then we'll have a little wrap session with you guys and set the record straight. And if anybody has questions, feel free. This is it. Let's get it all out right here. Let's do it.
Hello again, everybody. So Irela asked me to talk a little bit about the current situation in terms of what got us here, which we've talked a little bit about today. We've talked a lot about today, but sort of what the next steps were in terms of a reasonable assurance plan. So as many of you know, some areas of Biscayne Bay are declared impaired, and that's sort of a really technical term by way of the state's impaired waters rule. And the state is delegated authority through the EPA to sort of categorize and prioritize water bodies. And they go through this exercise every 2 years. Durham's data set, its longitudinal data set, is used in part as part of all of the other data that's entered into the state's database to do this analysis. And if you end up on the impaired waters list, the next step for you is you got to figure out one of two ways to go, which we'll talk about in a moment. But there are also areas of the Bay that have not necessarily been declared impaired, but where we know that there are water quality issues persisting, right? Like we've talked about today. So the question there is there a solution there? So you're not impaired, so you're not headed down sort of the state's path for you, which is to declare a total maximum daily load or establish a total maximum daily load and enter into a basin management action plan, which is sort of the remedy to the actionable item that goes along with the TMDL, because you have to be impaired for that to happen. And so Miami-Dade, in partnership with local, state, and federal partners, have really identified a path to move forward, even in those basins hardest hit ecologically up in the north part of the Bay, where there might not necessarily be impairments declared yet. And so what we mean by that is in terms of our options and two paths that we can take. Again, is when you first and foremost have an impairment identified. That's where the state says with a regular frequency, you are exceeding the state standard for a given parameter, whether it's total nitrogen or chlorophyll or dissolved oxygen, et cetera. Then they kind of decide how you are going to be prioritized. You're categorized. Impairments are what we call category 5 water bodies. So if you get thrown in that bucket, then the next step is, okay, well, what priority are you given within that bucket? And to give you sort of an example of where these questions and coming up with solutions are become really important is that, of course, the state is working at all levels, right? We just heard about Crystal River and the importance of our lakes and our rivers and our streams. The state's looking at those and prioritizing those as well as the estuaries and offshore areas. And so we compete with those resources for a TMDL and the next step being a VMAP to be set. And of the 20 or plus water body IDs, imagine the bay sort of broken up into puzzle pieces. We call them water body IDs or WBIDs. Imagine that over roughly about 20 of those, we have one that's deemed a high priority, and that already has a TMDL, and it's for dioxin in Wagner Creek. The others are slated as medium or low. And so the timeline with which we would eventually get to a TMDL being set and the time after that it would take to get to a VMAP, you're talking sometimes in excess of a decade. And that's coming from the state telling us that. And this is actually adapted from the state's information that they've shared with us about these processes. Now, there is an alternative to that. So if you are impaired, again, you're headed toward a TMDL and you have an opportunity to take an alternate route. Also, if you're trending toward, but are not yet declared impaired, you also have an alternative route. And that is through what's called an alternative restoration plan. And there's two kinds of those. The one we're interested in is called a reasonable assurance plan. A reasonable assurance plan is different from the second type, which is called a pollution reduction plan, because it is actionable. It is an order of the Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection. So it's legally binding with you and the stakeholders within that boundaried area. And it sets some really tough goals. So you have to establish not only what your loading limits are. So what are you currently experiencing in terms of that parameter being out of compliance or trending toward non-compliance? But you then have to come up with how you're going to reduce those loads. And so that's a series of projects and activities and education campaigns that get you there. So it's really about your threshold. It's the level of assurance you can provide the state that differentiates you in terms of the two alternative restoration plans, whether you're a pollution control or a pollution reduction plan, a 4E plan, or a reasonable assurance plan. The other reason why we're shooting for a reasonable assurance plan is not only because we're trending toward impairments in many of our WBIDs, and some that do have existing impairments or that were recently declared, was because having an order of the secretary, be it a basin management action plan, a BMAP, TMDL, or a reasonable assurance plan, we would have access to funding that we otherwise wouldn't have access to. And Mayor Living-Cava really wanted to see us accomplish the goal of being able to acquire and be eligible for it to start with wastewater funding that the grant provides, their grant program every year. This year, I believe it's to the tune of about 125 million. So it's going to be highly competitive. And to even get our foot in the door, we would need to have an order of the secretary, either through a BMAP, which we're at least a decade away from in some of these areas, or a reasonable assurance plan. So the state regards the reasonable assurance plan or alternative restoration plans as cleaner water faster. But we've noticed that there sometimes can be a bit of a misunderstanding about faster meeting less accountable, or faster meeting less rigorous in terms of the lift that has to be done in terms of determining what those loads are and how you're going to reduce those loads. And also maybe less rigorous in terms of the projects that you would move forward. So I think today we can talk a little bit about either through your questions, and we also have a representative from CDM here, our consultant, Joanne Prince. So thank you for being here. And CDM is a consultant that actually has accomplished a RAP in the Florida Keys. There's only 5 in the state. They generally take years to produce, and we're going to try to do this before the end of September. To be eligible for wastewater funding. So it's a feat. We are looking forward to working with our consulting partners, but also our state partners and the municipalities that will be sort of encompassed in those northern basins as we get this work underway. So with that, I will turn it back over to Irela.
Well, I love giving chronologies on things that we've done. And so as you can see, we kicked off the year. This is all, well, this is like, we're half into the, not even half into the year. And this is, where we are. And we're right about to start working with our stakeholders and our municipalities to get us to where we want to be. And it can be done by September, I'm sure of it, if we're all in it together. And we saw a great example of where we could be with Crystal River. Thank you for being here and thank you for coming. And see, stuff like that gives us hope, right? And so it can be done. And again, we have to start somewhere. It's going to be first a small wrap that will grow over time. But I mean, we're here to just provide assurances that this is the path that we're working together. We have weekly meetings with FDEP and their experts on BMAP, RAP, TMDLs, okay? So, and we have what we never had before, which is not one, but two boards to hold us accountable. So I'm here to really say that this is our path forward. This is just the start. As you heard our mayor say, it's just the beginning. We're not cutting corners. We're here. We've accomplished a lot and we still have a lot way to go. And so a lot of science, a lot of technical things that we have funding. We've been having a recurring funding source for the last 3 years from the state of Florida. $20 million coming up next. We had 20 million last year. We had 10 before, where the county matched the other 10. So that's something we've never had. We've never had this kind of attention. So like I said, it can be done. And if you walk into my office, it's right on the wall. It can be done. So that's the inspiration, and that's the motto. We'll go to the next slide. I think we had another slide. There we go. It's our bay, it's our wrap. Yeah. This is kind of like a little snapshot of the process. Just again, in an easy way to understand, because it can get very technical, especially for me. I'm not a scientist or an engineer. And my job is to be able to, simplify the message so that our policymakers feel confident enough to move decisions forward. We have a last one, but I think the last one is just Q&A. Let's do this together. We can. So again, this is it. I know there may be a lot of questions. There may be some skepticism. Yes, September is a tough. It's never been done before, but it's Miami-Dade County. We can do things. We have done things, so we're confident. And we're already moving forward on projects that we're going to get credit for. So we're kind of working the wrap into our existing programming. So it kind of works out, I think. I think we're good. So, questions?
Jim, over here.
I kind of like starting. I realize wrap is a great idea last time, but to what extent is the wrap rely on
Here's a microphone.
And the way they interpret the rule makes them almost useless for actually protecting the resources.
Thank you, Jim, for the question. And this is something that we not only dove in with DEP on this topic, and of course CDM, who's done this before, but we're still sort of waiting around in it. But I would say, and Joanne, please jump in and let me know if there's anything you want to add to this. But I would say the question sort of in two parts. The first is the question of targets. And we have talked with DEP about applying the nutrient criteria targets and extend them over the mouth of these canals that we're going to be working within, not the least of which is going to be the C7 and C8 off the bat. In terms of applying criteria, because as you know, none exists, not at the county level, not at the state level. And we, for expediency, are likely going to hold to those numeric nutrient criteria for the purposes of trying to set targets that our projects, as Irela pointed out, that are coming online will balance out, right, to reduce that loading. But I don't want to go on if you have a different question.
Well, no, it's the same question, but the problem is the rule and the way it's interpreted So that they have an extent of where water flow, here, the other pivot between all the stations across the entire pivot above that source. So then taking that and applying and extending it over the mountain canal doesn't help. You could have pure phosphorus coming into the canal, but move it out of the rest of the pivot. You would never have an exceedance if you're having a huge impact at the top of the canal. So that the whole way that it's applied doesn't work. I don't like it works.
Absolutely, but I think that
You're on the stakeholder.
but I think, Jim, that the way that, I mean, and there's different ways of doing this, right? That's part of the benefit of us, driving the train with our stakeholders, with all of you in the room and our municipalities, is thinking this through. But the state does provide a lot of great guidance in terms of just needing to have a target that would be scientifically valid and acceptable. And also regulating ourselves in terms of how we want to meet those marks. So for example, to your point about, let's say we apply a target, let's say 12 parts per million applies halfway up the Little River. And let's say that's in the town of either the city of Miami or El Portal or something like that. That binds them to whatever that target is. And so then we have to ask ourselves, how do we measure that metric? So and with what time frame do we look at this, 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, give ourselves that amount of time to see if septic to sewer conversions have made an improvement, if stormwater interventions have made an improvement, those kind of things. And then we can decide, are we looking at a project level? Like, are we literally looking at what's coming out of that outfall that's been retrofitted? Are we looking at sort of an area level? Are we looking at like a base level? So I think that might help jump into your question, and let's dive deeper into how best to set this up at the outset. So I think we need to hold that question. It's something we've already been talking about with the state. But I think we have a lot of space to figure out what will work for us and what will be, appropriate to hold ourselves accountable to. Does that answer your question?
Hello, hey, how you guys doing? I have a quick question for you guys. The gentleman over here with sea and shoreline, is there any possible ways for us to do a testing on the bay and see if we can regrow our grass the same way you guys did with yours?
I believe that was for Save Crystal River.
What? And then we're gonna have two questions and then shut it down. Okay, hold on 1 second.
Yeah, the answer is yes. It's through a habitat suitability model. But I just want to clarify, just replanting seagrasses in Biscayne Bay is not going to fix it'll help get seagrass back and allow the ecosystem functions, but it's not going to fix, you got to work on the eutrophication, the excess nutrients, and a lot of like stormwater conveyance plantings may help in that process, but just planting seagrass alone, it's not going to fix everything. Certainly.
Hi. I just want to piggyback on that. So when I asked the question and when our commissioners asked the question and when the mayor asked that question, because you would think, let's just replant the seagrass. And my good friends over here, Lee Hefty and Rashid Istanbuli from Durham will tell you it's going to die. We've tried that. It's not going to work. Got to get the water right first. And then we do the planting, just like in a garden. Same thing, same concept.
Hi, I'm Ansley Sampson with Everglades Law Center, and I talked a little bit about, tying the MS4 permit and the RAP together. Have y'all thought about how you might use that NIPD's MS4 permit to implement this RAP you're creating, especially given the fact that, as you describe it, it's going, you will have a small RAP that will be evolving, I hope, quickly over a longer period of time, and you've got a new MS4 permit coming due at a moment in time?
It's a great question. And it's so timely because Joanne and I literally were talking with the state yesterday about the ways in which we can use the MS4 permit, or perhaps it was the meeting before. I think we still are exploring the totality in which those things can relate to each other, the RAP and the MS4. But one of the things that they shared with us was, and you brought this up, Nancy, when you were speaking on your panel, that bacteria impairments, of which we have many, cannot be rolled up into a reasonable assurance plan, into a 4B plan. So you kind of stay in a TMDL category 5, because the thought is that bacteria is so dynamic and the remedies for bacteria are so sort of random in their effectiveness, that the state they don't believe they could be given reasonable assurance that a wrap could solve a bacteria impairment. But what they do suggest, and this is where you've uncovered this too in your work in speaking with our stormwater folks, is there is such a thing as a bacteria control or bacteria pollution control plan. That's considered a 4E plan. Of the two alternative restoration plans I mentioned, it's that kind of a plan where it's not binding in the same way, because again, they're not expecting that you can provide this overt level of assurance. But it gets wrapped up into the MS4 permit as yet another tool in our toolbox to help address it. So it has very specific BMPs, and we're really learning about this now through the state, what that can incorporate. And so we're going to be taking that back to our stormwater staff and seeing how, like, sort of where they are in the process, because we learned that they were sort of in the process. And I think we're going to try to incorporate that, but not as part of something that will sort of get us off the hook for bacteria impairments, but help drive it down through the MS4 permit, not necessarily through the wrap. If that answers your question. We're learning about this as we go too.
I have a question, Laura Reynolds, and we've talked about this a lot before. So as part of the wrap, it seems to me that we have the ability to potentially change the standards, because obviously, as Jim said, they're not low enough. And one of the things I hope you consider is really looking at the nutrient inputs, especially of phosphorus, without averaging them across the bay. Looking at the inputs along the shoreline versus offshore instead of averaging them, and reporting that in your report card, and then using that information to try to influence the way that we set our standards for numeric nutrient criteria, et cetera. And really using this process to show that we need to make things lower, because obviously it's not protecting the resource. We're seeing a loss of flora and fauna, which technically is a violation of our water quality standards. So there's that. So hopefully we can all work towards that process.
So that's a great question, Laura. And for folks who might not be aware, and I didn't get into the meat of this, but we learned that through the wrap process, you can actually establish new numeric nutrient criteria that the state can ratify and becomes the norm for that WIBID. So that is absolutely something we want to explore. And when Irela talks about sort of expanding this wrap, it's not just spatially, but it's also what tools can we bring in as we expand this? Because to do that means that there's much more rigorous evaluations in terms of why we think it should be set at that number. You remember establishing numeric criteria back in 2010. So that level of rigor has to take place because it has to, of course, be scientifically defensible. The state also suggests that you be prepared for challenges, legal challenges to that. So all of that in totality, it's a great opportunity. I think the county, we would consider all the ways in which we can take advantage of that through the wrap process, but I don't see us doing that now with this smaller sort of version of the wrap. But that you're right, that absolutely is a tool that the wrap allows for.
All right, thank you. I have a question. You guys, is there a way to create more marine protected areas in the Biscayne Bay? We run an eco tour, sailing eco tour in the Biscayne Bay, and we see so many people out, like just going over the seagrass, jet skis. Everybody who goes out in the water here, they know, especially on the weekends, people are having fun. Some people don't know, some people don't care, and I know you guys are doing a great job of these projects to protect the bay, but there needs to be a change in the culture, spark or shift in the voting scene in Miami. It's a lot of irresponsibilities. I think more marine protected areas where powerboats cannot actually go. There is one behind the Marine Stadium where is a manatee protected area zone, like a bay. If there is more of that in different areas, obviously you will need data and a lot of research to see what are the best areas. I think that will help a lot in sparking, the shift of culture, the sign out there that say, hey, this area slow. Yeah, I think it will be great. Is there a way to do that?
So it's a great question. I think the spirit of your question is something we talk a lot about internally at the county. So all of Biscayne Bay is actually protected either by the state of Florida through the Biscayne Bay Aquatic Preserves program, the state's Aquatic Preserve program, or Biscayne National Park. So it's part of the National Park Service. also the National Keys Marine Sanctuary. It's part of a national marine sanctuary down south. And so we also have boating safety areas. We have, manatee safety zones. When you see those signs that say slow during parts of the year. And you're right. I'm so glad you know about the Bill Sadowski Critical Wildlife Area and you're sensitive to that. And that is one of the few no entry zones we actually have here in Miami-Dade County. But the spirit of setting up a lot of these marine protected areas is to allow folks to swim, to boat, to undertake those traditional uses of the waterway. But you bring up a really good point, is that we have experienced a really intensive or a change in how intense the use has been of these kinds of activities, jet skis and boats, and the more intense kind of potentially damaging impacts. So I just want to say that, while there might not be new sort of additive protections there, protections exist. I think that the ways in which we all engage with our law enforcement partners and educational, and outreach groups like Waterkeeper and other folks, I think is really untapped. I think we really need to think more about the ways in which we can strategize those areas we know are known problems.
And I'll just end real quickly. I know we have seconds left. Dr. Crum mentioned this morning, every time I speak to groups, I say and I ask myself so that you don't have to ask me, what's my biggest challenge? Biggest challenge is education. We have so many people in Miami-Dade County, so many beautiful diversity across the board. We have people in the inland that have no connection to our water bodies. Okay. And so we have to do a better job, and we're working on that. We have to do a better job on education, advertising how important our Bay is out to every segment of our population in 3 languages or maybe more. And we also have to go into our communities and activate our communities and make those connections. We're working on that too. And again, you heard law enforcement, they're on board now. And if there are resources that we need, because we have more boaters in Miami-Dade County than anywhere in the state, registered voters, and then we have the illegal operations, we have a lot to do. But that's where governance come in, and that's where leadership comes in, and working also with our 34 cities. It's not just the county, it's the 34 cities that also have to be on board. And so creating workshops, bringing them in, everyone has to take a responsibility for this, because we made this mess, so we now have to clean it up. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And I just have one watershed follow-up with my watershed fisherman hat on. As a fisherman, the watershed, I think is very commendable, everything Miami-Dade County is doing for Biscayne Bay. With that being said, the watershed extends beyond the county's borders. So what does FDEP and the state, what can they bring to help manage the runoff issues from the canals that come outside of the borders of the county's fences that is sort of beyond your jurisdiction? What can the state do to help us more?
Well, that's something we would have to ask the state, wouldn't we? And we'll leave that there.
Thank you.